Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hello there, my name is Florian Kraner. I'm a game developer from Vienna and I am currently working on a game I've titled Landstalker, which is a Zelda-like action RPG meant to be in the style of 16-bit action RPGs from a long forgotten era. And as the title might hint at, it is inspired by an old game that's called Landstalker that was released on the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, depending on where you're from, in the 90s. So very long ago. And today I want to talk about Landstalker a little because even after many decades, it remains one of the games that left the biggest impression on me. Landstalker is in a genre that I would dub maybe isometric platformers. It is not a game that invented this whole idea of making a 3D platformer before 3D was even possible. So isometric views, because they don't have perspective, can be built with sprites, and that's why this is something that was attempted pretty early on much older systems even. Q-Bird comes to mind. Then on the NES, another game that happened to leave a big impression on me is Solstice. But I would say Landstalker is the one that also got a lot of other ingredients, right, that are independent of the isometric genre. So that's why it's the one that inspires me the most. But I think the game is mostly characterized by its isometric perspective and the fact that you are platforming in there, which is really very similar to what I would call a 3D platformer. And so I think it is really fair to say that the game was very much ahead of its time when it came out. Like most of these isometric games. And I very strongly believe that, at the end of the 90s, the 3D era started. We started to have dedicated 3D hardware for pumping through polygons faster, and everything had to be 3D, 3D, 3D. And because the game development scene likes to jump on new toys and then drop all the old toys and never play with them again, I feel like there were a lot of very fascinating concepts that just fell under the table in that time. For example, Landstalker has a, let's say, unofficial sequel in the game of Alandra, which is also a Zelda-like, but without the isometric part at that point. And when you look into the history of that game, that was made in the middle of the 3D hype, and so it was actually, you know, they had a lot of trouble getting the game through and marketed and everything because, for example, that was a PlayStation game, and PlayStation at the time was pushing for 3D only. We only make 3D games. Everything is 3D. So a game like Alandra didn't fit the narrative at all. Which, by the way, I personally think that the sprite games on the Saturn and PlayStation were absolute peak at the time. So this is an extremely tragic development because a lot of that skill got lost around that time. So I would say that Landra is like one of the really released at the end of pixel art, which was rediscovered a lot later, of course. But still, when you look into the stories of how these games are made and sold, it's pretty tragic. Anyway, one step back again. Getting back to Landstalker, I find it a bit difficult to research how things went down exactly in the development of this game. I do know that it comes from a part of Sega that was responsible for the Shining series, so Shining in the Dark and Shining Force and so on. And a lot of those people seem to have at some point transitioned over to make another game in the Shining series, which was supposed to be an action RPG for the first time. And I cannot tell you what happened then. At some point, it turned into its own project, but I can tell you that you can still find a lot of similar sound design, similar samples that went from one project to the other. So when you and the font I think is also very similar. So when you play it, you can also really discover all these similarities. And I've always found it very fascinating, but I couldn't tell you exactly what happened during the development of that game. Interestingly, though, now that I'm building a very similar game, I have to say I'm developing a whole new respect, because Landstalker is a pretty sizable action RPG. It has a big world, a lot of dungeons, and as I'm working on my own game, I'm just starting to wonder what crazy pace these people must have been working in, and how confident in their skills they must have been to just plop this out in maybe 2 years of development, while I'm sitting here in year 4 and barely have 10 hours of gameplay done or something like that. When Landstalker then came out, it was definitely part of the push on the Sega Genesis to have something to compete with all the RPGs that were happening on the Super Nintendo. I often feel like Nintendo makes these lighthouse products that then determine where the industry is going to go for the next 10 years or so. It's pretty crazy if you look at it. But for example, on the Super Nintendo would make a game like Zelda, and then from that we can derive many projects that try to target the same audience, and so they are, call them Zelda likes, and Sega didn't have a lot of that. So at the time, and a colorful action adventure in the same Zelda fantasy style like Landstalker was exactly what they were looking for. And well, then the game came out, and I think it turned into a bit of a cult classic. So it's very difficult for me to talk about this, because I am very well aware that Landstalker actually divides audience quite a bit. And the reason for that is exactly the isometric view, which the development team later dropped when they made Alandra, because it means if you are controlling your character in an isometric space, you are always going diagonal. And for some reason, people seem to have a lot of troubles doing that with the D-pad. And so if you look at old reviews of Landstalker, or listen to people discussing it, there's always a big crowd that really struggles with the controls of the game, which I find very fascinating, because I like the game a lot, so I internalized the controls relatively quickly, and I can vaguely remember struggling a bit at the start, but then it just clicks, and then you just do it, and it's completely fine if I play nowadays. But when I introduced some friends to the game, of course, I could observe how the game played like dog shit for them, to put it mildly, and they dropped it almost immediately. Um, so the controls are definitely a thing to discuss when you discuss Landstalker. But again, I feel it's something that you can get used to. If anyone intends to check it out, be patient with it a little, because I think, for structurally speaking, let's move into the game design a bit. It's really a beautiful game. You play Nigel, who is, let's say, adventurer, and he gets some intel on a big treasure being hidden on an island. So he travels to the island, and the island is your entire game world, which I always was a huge fan of. But I hate it when games try to build an entire world. Final Fantasy is a good example. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Final Fantasy, but this is something that always rubs me the wrong way, when they have a full world map and you're supposed to buy into the fact that this is a whole world, and essentially it doesn't even contain the population and the cultural diversity of Europe. And so a game like Landstalker that says, okay, we're gonna have an island, and that's our entire setting, and that island has, I don't know, 5 towns or something like that. That I can buy into that scenario much more deeply than I can into that of a Final Fantasy game, where you're supposed to be globe-trotting through the entire world. The second part about this scenario that I really like is that there is no save the world story. Even though the stakes get pretty high towards the end, it is still a character that is primarily motivated by becoming rich. That's why he goes there. That's why he's looking for the treasure. He's not there to save the world. And I'm sorry, I just buy that a lot more than all these teenage boys that travel around and then defeat God. That can be cool every now and then, but it's become such a trope that when you play a game like Landstalker, it's just so much more refreshing that your character has a relatable motivation. And then, of course, after a short introduction, we already start heading into isometric dungeon labyrinths, which is probably my favorite part. I think this is also the reason why Landstalker left a bigger impression than me than its unofficial sequel, Alandra. By any measurable means, Alandra is probably the better game, but Landstalker does a lot more with a lot less, let's say. So I mean, it's a Genesis game, and so it had a pretty reasonable development length. So it's not a game where you are handed, I don't know, 20 abilities like a Link to the Past, and then you can interact with the world. No, all you have is jump slash, and pretty much throughout the entire game it stays like that. And I find that absolutely fascinating because the complexity arises not through the abilities that the player can execute. The complexity arises through the level design. Level design is a very powerful thing, and it sort of establishes a dialogue between the designer and the player. And I've never felt that anywhere as strong as in a game like Landstalker, which has its interesting isometric perspective. So the thing with isometric perspective is that it's very hard to judge depth, of course, because there is no perspective. So everything has the same size. So, it could be anywhere in space along the line of sight. And so just by looking at the screen, it is not mathematical possible to solve it. Let's put it this way. And this is, I think, the main thing why I find Landstalker to be such an interesting piece of design. You cannot solve it with the visual information. This can lead to a lot of frustration with players, but I think that only happens when they don't manage to establish this dialogue that the designers are offering you. Because even though you cannot judge where a block is, for example, from just analyzing the visual information, as far as the designer is concerned, he will have an intention with placing that block. Very often, what happens in Landstalker when it clicks for you, you come into a room, it looks like a complete nightmare, you have no idea where the blocks are, but okay, let's take this puzzle step by step. So it becomes just visually clear. This is probably where the designer meant for us to start. So you jump there. Yep, that's how it works. And then, from here, it probably makes sense to just go in a straight line to the left, and that's probably where the next block is. So you take the hand of the designer and you jump into that direction, and tada, you actually land on the block. And as the game grows in length, of course, the designer then teaches you a certain language by which they design these environments, and this language becomes more complex and more interesting as the game progresses. And of course, at some point much later, you can then play with, breaking some of the rules you've established with the player, just to throw them off a little bit and to challenge them. And what I've just described, this concept of the designer speaking through their level geometry with the player, is such a strong concept for me that I can honestly say I have never experienced it like this strongly in any other game out there. And it is the primary reason why Landstalker left such a big impression on me, because it's a work of mostly pure design. And I'll get to the other parts too. There's more that I like about the game. And I mean, I'm dedicating my life to working on this concept for a reason, but I just wanted to really explain this part because it's also the main reason probably why I chose this to work on my own game. But of course, this is also another reason why people can be very frustrated with the game, because if it never clicks for them, then this language is lost on them, and then they just get frustrated because they cannot discern where the blocks are. I very strongly believe that we have entered a very bad state of history for video games where every company is trying to make a game for everyone, and that just leads to an absolutely horrible state where everything is completely flat and boring. And I much prefer a work like Landstalker that will piss off maybe 50% of its client base, but the other 50%, and let's be honest about this, considers Landstalker an absolute cult classic. But this is probably a good segue into the last aspect that I want to discuss with Landstalker, because there's one more ingredient that left a huge impression on me back in the day, and that is that ultimately Landstalker manages to be a pretty cinematic game for its time. I mean, nowadays you would look at Landstalker and laugh at this because, of course, cutscenes, story setups, and so on have evolved a lot over the decades. But if you look at the space that of the 16-bit era, then Landstalker is a game that I feel builds a narrative atmosphere like few other games of the time managed to accomplish. And I'll give you an example for that. There's this one moment forth into the game when you finally reach the big castle there, and when you arrive, the game decides that it's time for the kingdom to welcome you because you've done your first hero deeds, and they hold a banquet. So you honestly just get invited into the castle and you explore around and talk to the people, and then eventually you join the big banquet, and there is a scene where a composer just plays a piano piece to entertain the the people there. And that's just what happens in the game. You sit there, you listen to the piano piece, and then you have some last talk with the people who are eating up all the scraps, and then I guess you go to bed, and it's just such a dense atmosphere of something that happens in the game world. The game keeps sprinkling interesting narrative ideas in. For example, much later, well, the game sort of turns into a bit of a race about who can collect the MacGuffins first, and the villain actually overtakes you and is always ahead a little of your own journey, which is just such an interesting dynamic compared to how it usually is. You just collect your MacGuffins, and that's that. So much more interesting to have a villain that's ahead of you and that always outmaneuvers you. And this, in my opinion, peaks in a dungeon where actually both the villain and you explore it at the same time, but the villain is still always a little bit ahead of you. And as you explore the space, you see, a little bit ahead. There's, for example, a big ledge that you will reach much later in the dungeon, and there you, in a little cutscene, you meet the villain, and he mocks you about being, behind so far. Um, and, and he just walks really slowly to mock you, that you're no threat whatsoever. And it is such an immersive way of telling your story. And I mean, if I really think about it, I've played probably, I don't know, 50 JRPGs after that, and not a single one ever managed to get that part right. You're always the one who drives the energy in the story, and it just gets boring after so many times. And then I look back at Landstalker, which preceded all of these games, and it just got everything right in terms of the pacing. Yeah, I think those are essentially the things that made Landstalker such a special video game product for me. And yeah, so by the time the credits roll in Landstalker, you have really gone through something that feels like a large adventure and has been exciting most of the time. I think that Landstalker is a real masterpiece on so many levels. Okay, that is everything I think about my good old favorite game, Landstalker. If I've maybe inspired someone to check it out, I would caution you to give it a fair shot before you despair on the controls. The designers really knew what they were doing, and if you just give them a bit of a benefit of the doubt, you will find a game that is very rich, and still very enjoyable even to this day. Well, that's it. Thank you for listening to my ramblings. And if you're curious, I would be happy if you checked out my game, which is called Maze Stalker. And I'm trying to build it in the tradition that I just recalled. Oh yeah, and of course, happy gaming.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, Jim.
You're a fan of the Legion of Superheroes, right?
Yeah, I've been reading their adventures for decades.
Me too. It was tough at first with all the characters, but now I think I'm an expert.
It's not too hard to get into the Legion. And to make it even easier, we have a podcast called Long Live the Legion. We talk about different aspects of all its history to help you out.
So whether you're a new reader in the Legion Academy, or have your own flight ring, or anywhere in between, a Long Live the Legion podcast should be on your playlist.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.